Glen Hazel Heights might be Pittsburgh's most interesting abandoned neighborhood, because many of the roads, cul-de-sacs, and neighborhood infrastructure are still here visible today, just being reclaimed by the Appalachian forest. The site's history traces back to the start of World War II, when the War Department ordered the immediate construction of housing barracks atop Sugar Hill and Glen Hazel, providing dwellings to 1,000 steel workers and their families who were assisting in the war effort. Most of the project's units were filled by steel workers from Homestead who had lost their homes when the Department of War ordered the Carnegie Steel Company to expand their operations and start producing steel armor plates for the war theaters. The residents of the temporary war housing came from all income brackets, but were unified in their shared identity as steel workers. Eventually, however, the war ended and the deed to the property was handed over to the Pittsburgh Housing Authority. The authority briefly considered using the barracks to house veterans returning from combat, but the residents of Glen Hazel Heights largely opposed this measure, arguing that the veterans deserved better living standards than temporary barracks, which were already beginning to experience landslides and sewage issues, partially due to the fact that the Sugar Hill portion of the development lay atop a partially mined coal seam. The housing development, after all, was always meant to be a temporary war measure, but because Pittsburgh was facing a housing crisis, the Housing Authority decided to keep the barracks on the hill and lease them out to low-income Pittsburghers and their families. The apartments, which were never meant to last more than a few years, immediately became plagued with even more issues, and shoddy quickly became the word of choice to describe the complex by both city officials and residents alike. As the post-war years went on, the 1,000-unit development quickly became known as the most dilapidated, dangerous public housing complex in all of Pittsburgh, to the point of publicly being called a rat hole by the executives of the Housing Authority. As conditions in Glen Hazel Heights continued to decline, vandals and arsonists began burning vacant units, sometimes in an act of protest. But unfortunately for the residents of the neighborhood, these fires forced insurance companies to stop covering the neighborhood entirely. By this point, the city was finding itself in a difficult position. The most hastily built public housing units in the city were also becoming the most expensive to maintain, and more units were being condemned, burned, or partially demolished due to the conditions of the neighborhood. Despite that, the city was still furnishing apartments in Glen Hazel Heights with new HVAC systems and other utility upgrades well into the 1960s, to the point where the city was hemorrhaging money to try to kick the inevitable further and further down the road. As the wartime barracks entered an unexpected third decade of service, talks began stirring both among the residents and within the Housing Authority about possibly replacing the Glen Hazel Heights development with something more permanent and cost-effective. In anticipation of the barracks replacement, the city began drastically scaling back the service and maintenance of the community, and went on to shutter even more vacant units, refusing to allow new tenants into the complex. By now, the population of Glen Hazel Heights was around half of its original capacity, as other high-rise projects went up all around town. But with nearly 500 families still in the neighborhood now without proper maintenance, a bad situation quickly became worse. Conditions deteriorated so much by 1967 that a group of neighborhood activists began publicly calling for the resignation of several city officials, among them the Housing Authority Executive Director, who had previously called the neighborhood a rat hole. As it turns out, residents of Glen Hazel Heights reportedly attempted to contact him over 60 separate times regarding rodent infestations, safety and sanitation concerns, and other maintenance issues, but the director didn't respond to a single one of these requests. Publicly, the Housing Authority made a big fuss over the conditions in the project, but the authority rarely, if ever, clued the neighborhood's residents into what the authority's plans were for the area. The Glen Hazel Heights advocacy group accused the Housing Authority of exploiting what was supposed to be a temporary wartime barrack as a means to, in their words, placate the Negro by segregating impoverished black Pittsburghers on a hill away from the rest of the city in dilapidated, waterlogged housing that was never meant to last more than one presidential term. Soon, large employers in the city began to take notice of this issue. Amidst the poor conditions in the neighborhood, U.S. Steel, together with J&L, announced that they would be financing a multi-million-dollar study to determine the feasibility of raising the current community to construct nearly 3,000 units to house steel workers and their families, in a development the steel conglomerates would call Glenwood Park. When asked by a reporter why massive steel companies would want to meddle in Pittsburgh's most infamous public housing project, the J&L chairman responded, "First, because we need such housing in Pittsburgh, and second, because we at J&L think we can do it." As the decade came to a close, J&L and U.S. Steel financed a second $100,000 study to survey the subterranean conditions of Sugar Hill, which had been continuously mined for coal for decades, long before the impromptu World War II housing was built. The steel firms determined that while a good portion of the land was perfectly acceptable to build on, there were some areas that had been undermined to the point of being unsuitable for construction. But despite these findings, the steel giants believed that there was enough stable land to proceed with the plan. All the while, the residents of the barracks continued to write to newspapers and radio stations, fearful that the steel companies or the city had no real plan of what to do with the residents who might be displaced by the new steelworkers' housing. Residents of Glen Hazel Heights threatened to stop paying rent unless the city could address a number of their fears and concerns regarding the plans. First, residents insisted that they receive the highest priority in relocation if and when a new housing complex is built. The community also requested that they have a voice in the planning of the neighborhood, and that workers employed in its construction be hired from the surrounding working-class neighborhoods of Pittsburgh. By 1970, however, an economic recession would prove to greatly disturb both construction and labor prices, and USS and J&L announced that they were no longer interested in pursuing the Glenwood Park project, at least for the foreseeable future. With this new information, the Housing Authority announced that a Glen Hazel housing project would indeed continue, but at a capacity reduced from 3,000 down to just 550 families. While these plans were being drawn up, the original barracks were standing on their last legs. The Post-Gazette ran an article declaring the neighborhood a ghost town, something that was a product of the big war, before the present war in Vietnam. Only about 40% of the neighborhood was still occupied by this point, with the newspaper reporting that many of the neighborhood's residents had to loot and plunder the abandoned houses for things like siding and shingles, since maintenance from the city had halted for some time at this point. With the steel companies no longer interested in the project and construction becoming more expensive seemingly by the day, the Housing Authority was desperate to find a private partner to split the costs with. But as prices eased by the fall of 1971, it was announced that the federal government would once again be willing to put up funds to construct new public housing, but in a more permanent, peacetime manner this time around. The following year, the Housing Authority voted to finance a drilling study to further examine the structure of the abandoned coal mines underneath the property. From these drilling probes, it was determined that about 80 out of the more than 200 acres of land were suitable for building, or about 40% of the acreage. With these findings out in the open, at least 4 private developers expressed interest in building shopping centers or entertainment districts to accompany this federally funded project. This marked the first time in American history that a neighborhood would be deliberately planned through a public-private partnership. And moreover, this vacant site was one of the only remaining undeveloped and untaxed parts of what was still a very quickly growing city. This made Sugar Hill a blank slate onto which governments and private developers alike could paint whatever they wanted. A brand new master planned community designed from the ground up. And to sweeten the deal, current residents of the World War II barracks would be given the priority option of renting the public units once the construction completed. The 1970s, however, continued to prove fraught with challenges for construction. In the coming months, disagreements over federal construction wages took the forefront in the papers. The issue became a relatively delicate one, because should the government pay them too little, that would be unjust. But should the workers be overly compensated, the cost-sensitive federal housing project could quickly go over budget. And with inflation hitting 9% in 1973, The federal authorities determined that union construction labor would end up making the development too expensive, and the whole thing was put on pause. In 1974, however, the plan was resurrected and modified, and construction began on a senior living high-rise in the hollow approaching Sugar Hill, replacing many of the original barracks along Johnston Avenue, the main street running through the neighborhood. The Housing Authority, upon breaking ground for the project, reiterated their promise to house the neighborhood's elderly residents in the new complex immediately upon its construction. Accompanying the high-rise along Johnston Avenue were to be a number of suburban-style townhomes to replace the military barracks. The continuing inflation of the 1970s, however, caused the planned number of these units to drop from 500 to 300 to 150 to just 104. 34 of which could be built right away, but the remaining 70 units would need to be constructed once more funding could be secured. By 1976, both the senior high-rise and the 34 suburban homes along Johnston Avenue were completed. Residents still living in the old World War II barracks were immediately moved to their new homes, their previous ones bulldozed. When the old units were razed, demolition crews reported that the plumbing was clogged with rats, most of the homes were filled with stagnant pools of liquid, and the abandoned coal mines were causing some of the waterlogged structures to sink into the earth. Despite the several reports and digs over the years indicating that a good portion of the abandoned mine is perfectly safe for building, 1977 saw Pittsburgh's housing director announce to the press that the whole site was unbuildable. Later that year, the remaining townhouse units were completed, and the land on top of the coal mine now lay vacant with no real plan for its future. Around this time, it was announced that the Kane Regional Medical Center would soon occupy the northern bluff of the old barrack development, and ground broke on that clinic in 1982. When the medical center opened, the vacant land on Sugar Hill was brought up again for the first time, with the Housing Authority toying with the idea of having Calvary Cemetery take over the site. But this plan faced a good deal of opposition from the community, and wasn't brought up again. For decades, Sugar Hill and Glen Hazel Heights sat just like you see it today, an abandoned cul-de-sac high above the Monongahela River, slowly being reclaimed by nature. The vacant lot continued to waste away, and with all of the former residents of the Glen Hazel Heights project now housed in newer, safer construction, talks of building more housing on the land began to fade. Pittsburgh, it would seem, mostly forgot about this property on Sugar Hill, at least until 2002. "This is a treasure that is not being used," said City Councilman Bob O'Connor. The councilman had a vision of turning the bluff overlooking the river into a vast athletic and recreation complex, with ballparks, fields, and trails. O'Connor saw the success of the Shenley Oval, a city overlook which over the years has been home to horse races, automobile races, track and field events, sports, athletics, and more, and figured a similar project could be a much-needed improvement to an area that had long been lagging behind the rest of the city. O'Connor wanted to include programs in the park to help children of low-income households receive scholarships for their education, as well as use the park to create a general sense of pride for the community. For the city to be on board with such an initiative, the land would likely need to be reappraised, which would require yet another testing of the rock to determine whether or not the undermining of the hill would be an issue. It's not clear, however, if the city ever did pursue studying the land for these purposes. O'Connor's ball field proposal remained nothing but a small story in a weekday paper, never to be brought up again. The abandoned roads on top of Sugar Hill have remained untouched since the 80s, with the only modifications being the installation of an electric wire and the sometimes closure of the road to vehicles. And O'Connor was right, the views from the hilltop are absolutely underutilized. Clearly, there have been conflicting reports about the integrity of the rock underneath the hill, but it's definitely a safe bet that the hill's history as a coal mine probably has something to do with it still being vacant today. It certainly wouldn't be the first time in western Pennsylvania that an abandoned mine caused issues with landslides or stability. But even if the hilltop can't support a 3,000 family neighborhood like was originally envisioned, that doesn't mean that something can't be done with it. And while O'Connor expressed something meaningful with his ballpark proposal, this isn't something that could ever happen without sufficient support from the community, which just isn't happening right now. People just aren't talking about it. That doesn't mean there's no hope, though. Right now, Pittsburgh is entering a golden age of repurposing its industrial sites and vacant properties as green spaces and parks. In fact, a great example can be found just a quarter mile up the hill from Glen Hazel Heights in Hazelwood. When the steel mills left the neighborhood, Hazelwood's population and Pittsburgh's as a whole was cut in half, leaving complete chunks of the neighborhood abandoned and empty. But with enough support from the community and enough pressure on public officials, grants were able to be given to convert the vacant area into what was called the Hazelwood Greenway, a forested area of hiking trails, greenery, and scenic views. An even better example can be found half a mile across the Mon from Glen Hazel Heights, over in Hayes. Owned by the Hayes family for generations, this property was continuously mined for coal as Pittsburgh filled in the gaps around it. Ground stability issues from mining there threw a wrench into plans to develop the hilltop into a brand new master planned 21st century neighborhood. The land was then sold to a firm who planned to continue strip mining the property, but the forest was ultimately saved for preservation by a local advocacy group. If you want to see a really good video about Hayes Woods, check out this one by Knowles Explores and Explains. He does a great job explaining the history of how this huge chunk of the city has remained a dense urban forest after all these years. And now that Hayes Woods officially belongs to the city, it's been designated as Pittsburgh's new 5th main park, along with Riverview, Shenley, Frick, and Highland. I would argue that Sugar Hill and Glen Hazel Heights could possibly meet a similar fate to that of Hayes Woods or the Hazelwood Greenway, but much like those projects, these kinds of preservation or redevelopment actions only happen when people in the community actually step out and ask for them. That's ultimately how Hayes Woods became a park, how Glen Hazel Heights seniors were moved from rat-infested barracks into a modern high-rise, and how the Hazelwood Greenway got attention from public organizations. If you should take away one thing from the story of Glen Hazel Heights, it's that change, be it political, societal, or even just the changing landscape and scenery of your own neighborhood, very, very rarely just occurs on its own, but is often demanded by those who have a vision for how they want to shape things. I also hope the story of Glen Hazel Heights gives you some perspective into how hastily and haphazardly much of Pittsburgh was originally built, and how this hastiness and lack of planning often led to very serious consequences for people. The haphazardness also left serious scars, patches of vacant, abandoned land that is unoccupied, polluted, unsafe, or inaccessible. And by the way, the Housing Authority still owns this land on Sugar Hill, and hundreds of acres of similar lots all across Pittsburgh. As Bob O'Connor pointed out, the city could buy this land for $1, someone just has to tell them to do it. I do believe that this land is underutilized, and even if it can't support a big shopping mall or a big development, you don't have to develop the land to use the land. Just look at all of these examples all over the city. If you could see this hilltop site be transformed into one thing, what would it be? Do you like O'Connor's idea of a field of dreams, or would you prefer some basic hiking trails and overlooks? Let us know in the comments down below. If you or anyone you know has any memories of the old housing barracks in Glen Hazel Heights, be sure to share your stories with us, and if we got anything wrong, please correct us down below. As always, thank you very much for sticking around until the end. Looking forward to seeing what you guys have to say about this neighborhood. If you'd like to see more local myths, legends, and stories, be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. It's totally free, and we've got a lot more videos just like this in the works. Hoping you're having a fantastic day. We're those history guys.